Rebecca, is that still showing you as share, like the whole
It
thing?
is showing the, presenter view.
No. Any tips? Because this is, wait, let's try this.
I'm not sure if you have two screens, but if you share just the one screen that has your presentation
That's
popped
weird.
up on it.
Yeah, let me try again. This has never happened. So I am sorry to the many of you on this call.
Nice.
Yeah, it's weird. Hey.
Some folks in the chat are saying that it's in your display settings.
In my display settings on my computer. This is embarrassing. I do this a lot. So
No worries. We're all navigating the virtual world still.
you would think I have never done this before. It's in the PowerPoint when I head to, okay, thank you. Super weird.
I know for me, if I have two screens, I actually put presenter view, drag it over to one screen, and then have the presentation on just one side.
Yeah, let me see if
screen
this
two.
works. Yeah, let's try this again. Okay. How about now?
So I am seeing your PowerPoint, and then now I'm seeing your presenter view once again.
You're still seeing that.
Yeah.
What am I doing?
It looks like display settings are at the top right there, though, if you go back to your presentation view.
Oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. Okay. Can you?
So right there, display settings over to the left in the taskbar above your shared screen. Just right above there.
Right over here. Like,
it looks like display settings so it says show taskbar, display settings, and then end slideshow just up there.
yeah, it's not from my. Okay. Let me. Okay, hold on a second.
If you would like, you can also share the document with me and I can go through the slides for you. I know it's a very, very large slideshow.
Yeah, let me try this again.
Okay.
And see if this makes any difference. Same thing.
I can see your actual, oh, that's it. Perfect. Beautiful. It looks wonderful.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see ahead, but that's okay because I don't necessarily need to see what's next. Yeah, I'm really sorry. That's really never happened to me before, and you would think I've never done Zooms. So thanks for bearing with us, and let's keep going. So I have split our talk today into 4 parts: the economy, our industry, the profession, and then I'll end with the outlook. So what's going on in the economy? Generally, our economic indicators are positive, but we're seeing a lot of threats to the outlook. And I think that's pretty consistent with what we've been saying all year, to be frank. So there's been ups and downs with different measures, and I'll talk about the ones that are positive, but why we see these threats increasing. The weakness at architecture firms, so when we kind of get to the end, these are our headlines for this presentation. We are looking at a 2024 slowdown, but not equal across all sectors. So I'll talk about what that means, where we see the growth and where we see the softening. And then on the larger term, long-term rates, weak demand are making commercial construction, that's our most valuable place, but also multifamily. And so again, when I come back, but these are sort of the 3 overarching points that are going to guide us through this presentation. So what are those economic indicators that we look at, and where are those that are positive and where they're those that we're kind of keeping our eye on? So consumer prices have dropped. So that is good. That means that some of the things that the Fed has been trying to do with inflation and bring that down with interest rate hikes is sort of starting to affect those consumer prices. This is year over year. So we're coming off of a pretty high spike that happened towards the end of last year. Those 3-month T-bills are up in percentage. So that again is a sign of sort of these rising interest rates. And so the Treasury bills are also seeing a bit of a hike. The 30-year mortgage rate continues to go up. So that's tightened lending quite a bit. I'm sure you're feeling that for any of those of you working in single family residential, but we're also seeing it in commercial properties, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Consumer sentiment is up. So that means people are feeling generally okay about their own bottom lines, and they are doing spending as a result of that. And you can see that in retail sales, which are up too. So people have gotten into this groove of working from home, and the kinds of things that they're buying are still more on those goods and service goods side than on the services side. Although we have seen a return to people engaged in those things that rise the economy and spending, like eating out, and taking part in concert tours. Those kinds of things have actually been quite successful this year in particular. We have seen the spike in prices really have affected restaurant sales, but we haven't seen too much of a dip in people not going out yet. So even though food prices are up, when you go to, even if you go to fast food, you've seen those prices elevate. We're not seeing the drop off yet in activity because people are feeling generally pretty good about their household incomes. I'll talk about housing in a moment, but housing starts is something we keep our eye on. Housing is a leading indicator of the economy, whereas non-residential construction lags a bit. And so we'll talk about what that means and where architects actually sit in that cycle. And then payrolls are also up. So payrolls were significantly up in 2022 and in the beginning of this year. But the last few months of the jobs report, if you're sort of like a jobs report junkie like I am, have seen some softening in some parts of the market. But we're, again, coming off from some of the strongest employment numbers that the U.S. has seen in recent decades. And some of that is recovery from the deep losses we had from the pandemic. But we generally are a pretty healthy workforce. But this softening in recent months is something that we're keeping our eye on, because that again goes into things about comfort of household spending, which has these sort of trickle down effects into our economy overall. So if you're wondering, like, what are the things we take a look at, these 7 indicators are of the majority of the ones we sort of try to track every month. So let's get into it a little bit more. So while the overall outlook, I mentioned this in the beginning, has improved, we are seeing those dark clouds on the horizon. And here's the 5 that we would argue are sort of the top ones we're concerned about. There still are some regional banking concerns. So we know we had that unprecedented bank disruption, a regional bank implosion last year. The Fed did not expect that. No one expected that. So even though they've recovered nicely, all the protections that were supposed to be in place worked, there is still this lingering concern and wanting to make sure that that doesn't happen again, that there is a clear expectation, and therefore we're seeing some tighter lending standards in a way to kind of hedge off any potential risks of something similar happening in the future. The second thing is we are still seeing fights at the federal level. So we play whack-a-mole here in the DC area and sort of hedging, like, are we going to be working? Are we not going to be working? Are we going to be working? And with the new speaker, anything's kind of up in the air. There's sort of speculation on both sides, going into a federal election year next year, wanting to kind of go in that looking like a strong party from the Republican side. And of course, White House has interest as well in seeing the budget be passed. So, but we're still seeing that fight at the federal level, very partisan, and when it comes to budget, as it has been in recent years with a split White House and Congress. Student loan repayments are back up. So even though there was forgiveness of some of those federal loans for longtime payers of their debt, there and the freezes that persisted during the pandemic, those repayments are starting back up, and that will have a little bit of an impact on spending. And then again, the final piece, which you in California are probably feeling pretty strong, but a lot of the labor issues and disputes that are going on in industries and professions, in several of them, not just UWA, but as you know, screenwriters, actors. So there has been these labor disputes going on that does affect the economy as well. Third element we're looking at is, again, the re-acceleration of inflation. So there is indications, there's debate. Again, the Fed's sending signals that they're not going to tick up interest rates again. However, some leading economists don't quite believe that. They do see potentially another quarter hike coming. And so we're sort of keeping our eye on that and tending to take a little more of a conservative view as we prepare. So expecting that there might be, again, another tick up in that interest rate to try to hedge off this inflation rising again. But we are starting to see oil prices rise. We're starting to see those labor price costs going up. And those are some of the things that we keep our eye on as to, where is inflation going? In terms of the geopolitical tensions, I don't think any of us are unaware of those. While they don't have direct impact on the US, certainly there are significant indirect, right? Both from budget outlays that we are doing in our defense spending to send overseas, supply chain disruptions. We definitely saw that with oil and gas coming in the early stages of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. And other materials. We are a global economy. And so that piece is something we also keep our eye on as to how that's going to disrupt or affect our supply chain, as well as our debt and spending. And then finally, the meltdown of the Chinese economy. So I know we have this in the geopolitical tension, but particularly that one, since they own so much of the US debt, is one that we are more concerned about than in terms of its bottom line impact on us from a macroeconomic level. So some things I thought I wanted to kind of give a sense of some of this tightening that we're feeling, right? A majority of banks are reporting that credit standards are tightening, right? Either that they've tightened considerably or somewhat, or remain unchanged. But no bank that were in this recent survey said that lending standards were loosening up, right? So this means that there's going to be less dollars that are being available to invest. And we know that, where owners can get money affects our businesses and so on. So I think us also wanting to see where those lending flexibility is something that's particularly kind of ahead of our cycles and then ahead of where the economy is going. So this is a leading indicator for us that there might be some tightening going on. We have had a strong commercial real estate lending post-pandemic, right, coming out of that. Then the interest rates, of course, spiked up, but we still saw lending in 2022, but we've definitely seen a softening of that in 2023, particularly in the last quarter. So again, this commercial real estate lending goes into our bottom line, right? Gets ahead of our cycle from a forecasting perspective. We're also seeing property types have declined value but they're coming off relatively high spikes. But that modulation that we're seeing, like right the month, so you can see the bigger drops, which are those blue bars across the board, particularly in apartment and office. And apartment and office are a theme you're going to see as I go through later parts of this presentation as well. But in recent months, we're starting to see those prices kind of start to stabilize. So that's a good thing from an investment standpoint. But again, with those lending with those lending tightening, even though prices are coming down, we're not sure we'll see the investments that we had seen in 21 and 22. I mentioned our labor force. So again, this is one of our macroeconomic pieces that we look at. We are back to pre-pandemic levels, but our younger women and workers going into 2022 do still lag. That being said, the June numbers just this past year did show the highest reported rate of women that we had had in a long time. So even though you can see on this slide, we're still sort of down lump, and overall women aren't as invested in the workforce, we are still seeing them kind of starting to come up and be looking for work in those prime age years that we keep our eye on. So, you know, some decreases, but now we're starting to see some light. So from an age perspective, we're still not seeing the same with that younger demographic kind of coming in the right after school. But we are, there are some positive signs with the labor, as well as some of the decreases I mentioned. So let's shift from the economy at a macro level, and let's talk a little bit about our industry. So in terms of spending in residential, non-residential, we still are edging towards $2 trillion. So that's been pretty consistent. This is the second largest contributor of GDP, about 8%. Second only to healthcare. So we are part of one of the most important important portions of the economy. And we have a really important place in that I'll talk about in a second. In terms of where architects go, so does the economy. And I think that's something I try to impress every time I do one of these presentations, to know that our disproportionate impact on the economy. In terms of where you can see the spending of that $2 trillion and how that's mapped out last year, most of it is you see about a third kind of in single family and multifamily, so in the housing sector. But we're seeing a lot in home improvements. I'm going to talk a little bit about that spending sector, but the renovation and remodeling part is also has been ticking up considerably in recent years. Commercial at 18%, institutional at 15%, as well, kind of round out things. And we've had a lot of public works projects being put in place. Less of that is hitting architects, and actually in some of the growth in the commercial industrial side also doesn't hit our profession as strongly. So what is happening in spending across those sectors? It has been very strong in 2003. The construction spending part has, and AI, we predicted this, right? Our Architecture Billings Index, and I'll show you those numbers in a little bit, but they predicted, your billings predicted, that we were going to see this increase in spending this year. And so that's what we're seeing bear out across all sectors at this point, but strongest growth is coming off some of the strongest declines. So lodging had such steep declines in 2020, was still lagging in 2021, and has finally kind of come and bounced back. But again, that 24% growth, if you look at those straight numbers, that 17 billion in spending, is still significantly off the numbers that we were seeing in 18 and 19. So to bear that in mind, but that growth is really positive. Manufacturing up again, a lot of this pharmaceuticals, as well as in the oil and gas sectors. On the institutional side, healthcare, education really have recovered nicely, and on the spend side, as well as some of our transportation and amusement projects. So again, across the board, pretty good looking construction spending on the construction spending side this year. So I'm going to pivot a little bit into housing. I want to dig in because there's some interesting insights that we have going on in the housing sector. We are seeing some serious headwinds at present. And that's why we're sort of like general macroeconomic trends. As I mentioned, there's some positive signs, but one of the places that I said I was going to get to later was in housing, and we are seeing those headwinds. And so again, because housing is that leading indicator, it makes us a little very cautious about 2024 again, which I'll get into a little bit more. High housing prices have continued to affect affordability in households. And then, as I mentioned, with those interest rates, mortgage rates have gone up considerably as well, which makes housing affordability a problem, which again starts to constrict household spending opportunities, savings, and all sorts of things that then have ripple effects on our economy. So some of the strategies for housing, which we're seeing as opportunities, are some protecting of existing housing stocks. We're not seeing people move as much. We are seeing some conversion of access commercial spaces. I got some interesting insights on that in that regard coming up. And then we're starting to see ADUs, so accessible dwelling units, also emerging. And I know California is one of the states that's a little more friendly to ADUs in some of your jurisdictions, but that's a challenge for some other parts of the US. So in terms of, so let me dig in a little bit. So in terms of the housing prices, as I mentioned, they've been on a tear, right? So accelerating significantly, just didn't ever kind of go down. Actually, in the pandemic, housing prices stayed pretty solid. I used to talk about the pandemic as a recession of sort of a tale of two stories. Those of you in single family housing or renovation, in particular in housing, kind of knew it stayed pretty strong. There's a lot of spending on people's homes and adapting them to working from home scenarios. So we never saw the downturn dramatically that we saw in the non-residential sector. And obviously nothing near the crash that happened that led to the Great Recession back in the early 2000s. So, or 2008, 9. So we are just, we thought the levels in 2006 were high, and now we're seeing things kind of crazy in terms of housing prices. So that house slowed the growth, which is, part of what you want, right? That's a little bit why you raise interest levels. You want to slow some growth. But we haven't, unlike other things that we've seen start to drop, we really haven't seen housing prices drop, but we have seen that growth kind of in recent months stabilize a little bit. So that's some good signs, but we'd like to see it start to move down. But, kind of these things go hand in hand. So until we see interest rates and lending sort of easing up, we're probably not going to see prices start to go down either anytime soon with demand as high as it is. Again, as I just mentioned, those fixed mortgage rates have been trending up. And they're currently sit at 8%. So again, we came into 2022 with historically low percentage rates. Actually, 21 was even lower. And then we've just, as they've raised the interest rates to try to combat inflation, we're now up at 8%. We hadn't been up at that level since the early 90s. So housing starts, we have seen those declines, but they are still healthier than they were from 2015 to 2020. So again, this is why we're sort of like, there's still demand for housing at a place where where there's still room for that market to grow. That being said, some of our projections are based on assuming certain things haven't changed in the economy. And we know that's not necessarily true for some parts of the country versus others. And so housing is becoming more and more, it was always a local market issue, but we're starting to see some of these big divides happening more and more locally. And since AIA doesn't collect that information, we try to contextualize it as much as we can, but we do recognize we're looking at this more from national demand, and that localities are really seeing some changes in terms of where the activity and spending is. Home improvement, as I mentioned, relatively healthy. AIA has a home design trends survey, a panel of architects that work in the custom residential market, single family space. If any of you work in that area and are not on our panel and are interested in being part of this, we'd love to have you participate. So my email's on the final slide and love to have you reach out. But this is the survey we do quarterly. And we do look at trends within housing and how they've moved over time. So we do ask these every single year. And then we keep a quarterly running on the conditions that single family housing architects are finding in their activities. So you can see here that they're reporting remodeling up year over year, and that's already on strong growth, and that was on strong growth. So this has really been the bread and butter sweet spot for where homeowners are investing in, is in the remodeling space. We're starting to see those first-time home buyers affordable homes. This is the second year in a row we've seen decreases there. Move-up homes also seeing a decrease that had gone up during the pandemic, and seeing kind of vacation homes as well. So some of these things that were very strong in 2020 and 2021 have started to sort of ease off, but remodeling has stayed strong and continued to grow. So again, starting to see some shifts in the trends that we were seeing right before and then during the pandemic. But, again, when we think holistically at some of the trends, we're still significantly below our historic levels of home building in terms of the units that we're putting into play. And, we are projecting new housing demand. So as I mentioned, when we add up all of the things we're looking at, we would think that these numbers would be back at this 15 level. And the way that we compute that, or the way that the Joint Center for Housing Studies, who we work with, compute that, is they look at household growth, they look at the secondary homes, and they look at the stock losses, and kind of add those all up. But as we saw here, the second homes are looking, I'm gonna go back, right? The second homes are looking kind of slower or flat. So if that happens, then some of these calculations, go off a little bit. So, but we're trying to, just to give you a sense of sort of what that mix is, to look at demand and see if there's still some growth there. So kind of a mixed bag a little bit in housing. There's some places where we would expect some growth, but again, with prices so high and lending so difficult, and it taking such a proportion of people's income, it's a little bit tighter. And as I mentioned, again, taking a significant amount of their income, that's tightening up. And you can see they're just still continuing to feel burdened by the cost of housing, right? And that's one of the key components in what your standard of living is, right? So we just came out with our compensation report, and I was doing a session kind of helping new grads kind of decide where you're going to go live, and assuming you have some flexibility. We were talking about the factors that go into standard of living, right? And you have to look at your debt, you have to look at your housing costs, you have to look at services with housing, so food and gas and those sorts of things, commuting time, and then your income, right, to balance out the costs. And when we start to see how much housing is in certain areas, I think this is prompting some of the shifts that we're seeing where people are moving away from and moving into. And I know you guys have felt several of those shifts and tightening in your different markets, when we start to see where some of that's going. But I mean, it's very problematic when you look at the severely burdened numbers for renters. That's more than half their income's just going on a place to live. And so those are the kinds of things that we look at, that disparity between those that are able to buy a home and get lent and be able to afford the interest rates and get lending and have the money to put down, and those that are in the rental market. Again, this kind of disparity of our economy and how it's hitting some people more than others, right? So what are some strategies to increase housing opportunities? Well, preserving the existing stock, conversion of the oversupply, right? I'm kind of repeating these again, and reducing the barriers to building. So let's dig into those. Preserving the existing housing stocks, we do see opportunities in affordable housing. We know that there's a housing crisis for people who can't afford these high rents, right? It just sort of showed that burden. And so this is a place where there can be engagement if we can get, the funding to be part of that. So there is a need for affordable housing, and I don't think that's I don't think that's a surprise to anybody on this call or anybody that we talk to. About 7 million homes nationally are deemed inadequate and have severe physical concerns. And this infrastructure in the United States tends to, in general, have this problem. But that's something that we keep our eye on too, right? So that means we do need an investment, that continued investment into that existing stock. So making them more resilient is one of the critical objectives that we're keeping our eye on, right? And there was the federal legislation that was put into place in the Build Back Better. And that did kind of focus on home improvements as one of the areas of investment. But there's estimates of 170,000 homes lost in the inventory annually just from natural disasters. And I'll kind of show a little bit of why that's, just kind of give you a graphic that shows that the extremeness of these natural disasters that are affecting our building stock. Home sales did dip this year, as we might expect. And we do last year as well a little bit, but this year you can see here, definite weakening in existing home sales. People are staying put because they just can't afford to move. And I mentioned again that inadequate, right? Spending. So inadequate conditions that do need investment. I mean, again, this is across the board. We're seeing a pretty substantial amount of homes that are severely needing improvement. But look, again, rental units being entirely more problematic than owners who are able to get the capital to invest in their homes. So again, leading to this cycle of inequity across parts of the United States versus others, but also pointing to need that we can help come in and solve for those of you working in that space. So I mentioned the increase of natural disasters. This is a chart that kind of shows those, and we're only expecting to see more when we look at some of where the projections of those that are working in the space are looking at for the 2024 storm cycle. I mentioned conversion of commercial facilities. We are starting to see this become a really interesting trend, right? It started in the, it's actually been going on for a while, but then spiked in 2020 when we saw, people were leaving, right? They weren't using those office spaces, but we know we have an affordable housing and a housing crisis issue in terms of with portions of the population being homeless. And so, we did start to see apartments kind of shifting from hotels that people weren't going and staying at, as well as from offices. So the hotel part has eased, right? As travel has ticked up again, but we're still seeing that conversion, the offices have eased as we start to see people going back into the offices again. But on the hotel side, we're still seeing a lot of that conversion over and again. I think some parts of the country more than others is this where we're seeing that on the hotel side. In terms of the quantity and where that office conversion are planned, you can see that it is not insignificant. 1.4% of all office space, or 60 million square feet, are being planned to convert nationally. Here's where you can see San Francisco is one of the top 10 markets that we look at. So bringing in a significant portion of that office space above that national average, so about 3%, and about 3 million square feet as well being converted over. So we're seeing this in cities across the US, more so in Chicago, Dallas, Boston, and DC, but pretty strong in San Francisco, kind of on par with New York City as well. I mentioned ADUs at the start. They can offer affordable housing options. So Freddie Mac did a study that identified 1.4 million square feet of homes that had an ADU. That definition is sort of varies, right? So while in some places it's very clearly defined, in others, kind of what defines an ADU, and you can see some of the photos sort of suggest different ways it could look. There are some laws that have encouraged the construction of ADUs, your state being one of those. But it is still a burden in other parts of the United States. I heard a presentation from someone in Idaho who was lamenting and trying to change policy because they had some affordable housing crisis need and really had a lot of land. So saw this as a potential and are trying to change some of the policies. So we're starting to see that more and more in some of these states that didn't used to have higher housing prices, but are seeing prices go up, but not incomes go up in line with those cost of living increases. And NAHB did a study and showed that a fifth of remodelers undertook a project that included an ADU. So again, a trend we're keeping our eye on, and we'll start to ask in our home design trend survey. Or continue to ask, that's right. So you can see again, this trend has continued to pick up, and is something we'll keep our eye on as we move forward. I mentioned housing prices going up, and I mentioned the elevated mortgage rates. And despite that, many do feel like this market has bottomed out. So, and will grow. So it's sort of, again, I know I keep coming back to the mixed bag, but this is, we're starting to see some things counter. So we'll see, right? If the prices and lending start to kind of ease up, if we're able to eventually bring interest rates back down, if salaries go up at the rates that they would need to, we might start to see some building happening again. But there's kind of a mixed view in terms of economists in this space at the moment. I mentioned some cities are being invested in more than others. So San Francisco stayed in the top 25 markets for home building. But really you can see this movement, right? This swath through the central and southern states, but people sort of not seeing as much concentration in other parts. That being said, this is new home building. I'm not sure if I put the remodeling up, but there are some suburbs of San Diego, including San Bernardino, Sacramento, where we're seeing a lot of investments in home improvement projects. So, some of the movements to those cities as opposed to departures, because you can see here, San Francisco is the New York City and LA and DC are the cities where people are looking to leave and relocate into other parts of the United States. So this means a lot for our local economies, and points to affordability as one of those key factors, and the rise in remote working as well. Where they're actually looking to go, I think this is not surprising. As I mentioned, those southern states is where we're seeing the migration generally. The home buyers are also looking in the Southwest, but Sacramento, and I think if we kept going, I think San Bernardino makes the top 25 list, also makes the top list of home improvements. So let me pivot and talk about our profession. So kind of gave you a snapshot of the overall economy and then looked at residential and non-residential market overall. So how are we doing? Where's our businesses right now? So we saw obviously lots of job losses in 2020. We are back at the levels of growth that we had going into that. That's sort of like, oh, are we going to lose it? Are we not going to lose it? How's the economy? Oh, it's been strong for too long, right? I think we're kind of now catching up with some decisions that were made coming out of the Great Recession, and we're feeling some of that as well right now. So jobs did spike earlier this year, but we're starting to see a leveling out. So around that 200,000 workforce. The numbers went up, so we always lag. So these are the September numbers that were just released in November, but the category that we live in is only lags 1 month. So when I look at that, it has increased. So I think we're going to tick up probably about at 202-ish, the October numbers. So I think that's about where we are. So, not seeing heavy loss at this point, but it is starting to kind of level out and tick down from this growth that we had seen. That being said, the census puts out a quarterly study looking at different professions and their growth. And architecture is supposed to grow, I think, about a need for about, I think, a 5% growth over the next 10 years, which is ahead of other professions. So it's needing more workers, according to the feds. But as always, caveat, but those workers are expected to come mostly from people retiring or leaving to go to other professions. And so this is where we really are keeping our eye on the staffing concerns, and not losing people. I mean, it's one thing to have a need to supplant people who are retiring and in those kinds of cycle and look at succession planning, but losing people to other professions that are coming out of architecture schools, where there's a responsibility on firms, and a whole slew of factors that go into retaining those architecture school grads into our profession. And so we're keeping an eye on those projections, but so is Department of Labor and Census. And I think, so staffing is really like a hot topic right now, because of some headwinds that we're looking to see, but activity is still had been strong, and I'll go into this. So I mentioned before that where architects go, so does the construction marketplace, and then therefore so does the economy. So our architecture billings index is a super simple diffusion index that AIA created over 25 years ago. And it literally tells whether your billings at your firm are up, flat, or down month over month. And that simple number, if it is over 50, suggests growth, right? If it's under 50, it means there's declines in billings month over month. And this number is the best predictor of where the construction marketplace is going in 12 months. So I mentioned construction spending, very strong now. 12 months ago, your billings numbers predicted that. And so if we look at these numbers now, we would expect a year from now, we'll see construction spending dropping 9 to 12 months from now. So, and I think we're seeing the forecast, I'll end with the forecast, where we're seeing the forecast sort of show that as well. So ABI did see 2 months of dips in August and September, even more dramatic. We had not seen that number since we were in the pandemic, that level of decrease. And not to jump in front of our ABI that will release next week, so I'm not going to tell you the numbers, but when I took a look at it, when it was coming in, it's suggesting we're seeing declines for a third month in a row. So definitely we're projecting declines 9 to 12 months from now in the construction spending coming off of these numbers and these tightening conditions at your firms. We also saw design contracts. So we keep trying to get as farther ahead of the marketplace. So billings, I mentioned, are about 9 to 12 month predictor of that spending. Contracts, we're trying to get a few more months ahead of that, right? You sign a contract before you can bill. And those are also going down. So, and I would assume preliminarily that we're going to see that same decline again. So third month in a row, going into the next year. And backlogs are showing that too, right? So we're starting to see work, some of those high backlogs are starting to come down. So projects are starting to come off the rolls, and therefore, but not bring in those new contracts, right? So healthy backlogs are a good thing because they can get you through these slower times. So we keep our eye on this, as well as what the rate of the stalled projects are, which we haven't seen too much of that when we've talked to firms and polled them. Not as much seeing projects stalled, are seeing some things delayed, but also are finally working off some of the backlogs. So this is something that we report on quarterly, and this came out last month. So when I dig into the ABI, so I mentioned it's down, but where is it down geographically, and where is it down from a sector perspective? And this is where you can see the sort of those markets really peeling off. Multifamily has been a drag all year. So those of you working in multifamily, this probably is not a surprise, but we are starting to see those numbers have been really soft all year. And, I think that goes hand in hand with affordability, as well as people staying put, so not moving, and as well as lending. So multifamily been very, very slow. Commercial, there's some serious concerns that we are keeping our eye on as well. That's been soft this year too. The things that's been keeping us kind of afloat and pretty, sort of firms are continuing to bill at is in the institutional sectors. And those still look relatively good, frankly, this year and next year. So it is becoming a, where are you diversified as a firm? Where are you able to, what sectors are you working in? And that's where we're starting to see some divergence and not convergence in these numbers. Regionally, same thing. While we saw dips across the board this in Q3, and we like to round out we do like to report on them quarterly because you can see the trends a little bit more clearly than when you look month over month. But September really influenced that Q3 number. But August, as I mentioned, was also a decline. You can see in California, which is the biggest sector that's making up the West number, big drops in billings in the last 2 months. So, but we're seeing that across the board, but the biggest drop, certainly, as you can see here. So those billing declines are, again, something that, contractors keep their eye on, investors keep their eye on, to balance out, because this does predict a slowness in the market in 9 to 12 months. So let's put this into context, however. So we give lots of bad news, but I like to give it a little context, because how bad is the news, right? I think we all still feel, the housing, crisis and the Great Recession, or as I heard someone call it, a little depression, in 2008 to 2012. And we're not anywhere near that. So the dot-com crash, this is what architecture, as I mentioned, right? We're that precursor to the economic downturn. So when we started our first month, right? When we started to see the decrease, we saw that continue to decrease, right? In the dot-com, but relatively stable. In 2008, I mentioned 2010, 2012, the Great recession, little depression, those numbers really kept going down, right? 9, 10, 11 months in, just still steep drops over steep drops over steep drops, right? No growth. So nothing that's under that 50 line is growing. So it goes up, but that just means it's less bad, right? From a chart perspective. So, and then the pandemic, super, super sharp declines, and then lessening declines until finally about a year in, lasted about a year, we started to see growth. So we're really been hovering around this 50. So the first, on the downside, right? So kind of, firms generally pacing out a slowness, but these last 2 months have been where we're starting to see some of those deeper declines. So we don't expect the market's going to be as bad, certainly, as we've felt in other recessions. But, there are areas of concern depending on where your work is. And I think that's sort of one of the unique pieces of this particular slowdown, is that it hasn't been felt in all sectors in the non-residential space, right? We sometimes see, again, housing and non-residential sort of flip-flopping, but we don't usually see quite this spaces that we're seeing coming out of this one between the commercial, multifamily, and institutional sectors of non-res. So I want to talk about 3 areas of trends, which is sort of my favorite part of talking about what's happening in your firms. So if I was there, I'd be asking you guys some questions to try to get you engaged. So instead I'll ask them, but I'll let you think about them versus me being able to respond to you. So I want to talk about profitability, productivity, and technology to wrap up. On the profitability side, so I won't do raise of hands because I didn't do a poll, but I just want to keep this in your mind. So in 2023, how do you expect to end your profitability? You think it's going to be up over last year, flat, or down, right? Continuing to take into account that most firms are pretty strong at the beginning of the year and going into the year. And so when we asked this question a few months ago, there was varying projections about 2023 profitability, but on average, most firms expected those numbers to be comparable to 2022 or above, right? So what's interesting is this map has not changed. So we recently asked this question, it'll be published next week, about revenue, profitability, and expenses. And we're still starting to see this year ending okay, but some concerns going into 2024. What are those things affecting profitability? Staff shortages, staff compensation, really being, and staff productivity to a lesser degree, but really being the big things on the staffing side. So I mentioned that's sort of one of those really sensitive things we're trying to keep our eye on, but balance it out, right? So architecture, I should have put in a chart, it kind of looks at needed positions versus positions that are filled, and we always sort of are off cycle a little bit, right? Like we have too much work, not enough staff, or then we have too much staff, not enough work. So I know a lot of firms have been trying to do a little bit of that math to try to keep those numbers, right? So I think that's part of why we saw backlogs each up too. We know you were fighting to keep staff in 2020. So, it continues to be the largest place of expenses, and therefore like the biggest hit on profitability. Other areas of concern are supply chain, materials prices and material availability, been all over the place in terms of some of those commodity prices and being able to get the materials you need to do the work. And then some of those other overhead costs, competition, your accounts receivable. This is a business that does operate sometimes a lot of bad debt and a lot of receivables that need to be spent or need to be collected. So those are all things to keep eye on too. Not as big of a problem in terms of looking at undercutting profits, but certainly is there. So profitability, so another thing to keep in your head is, do you measure productivity? Do you measure productivity at your firm? This is something that I've been really curious about, how we can get our hands on measures so that we can improve that. It's notorious that our industry, and more on the construction side than in architecture, but is evaluated as less having lower productivity than other innovations that have led to increased productivity. And in terms of architecture firms, so measuring, you got to measure, you don't know what you can't fix, what you don't know, right? So we wanted to just get a handle on some of the perceptions of staff productivity as it relates to the pandemic, right? So y'all are mixed, right? This is firm leaders. Most of them think that productivity has decreased from the whole work from home and lack of collaboration. The equal percentage think it's remained about the same, and a lower percentage the increased productivity. What's interesting is that when we ask everybody in the profession, there's a little bit of a flip between the bosses, right? So this is firm owners and firm leaders, firm principals, and owners who report these numbers. When we have asked staff, so all architectural professionals, and we pull out the firm owners, these numbers are about flipped. So that's an interesting dichotomy between the perception of staff and the perception of firm leaders, and those not necessarily aligning. But I mentioned, do you measure it? And most architecture firms don't. or they qualitatively do, right? So like it's my gut. And for smaller firms, this makes sense, right? You don't need to have some of these same metrics that you do at a larger firm. But the ABI panel, the firms that are in this aren't our tiniest firms. So these are firms that, are in non-residential space and are doing, who have staff and are doing projects. So, the fact that a third of our profession don't monitor anything related to productivity is kind of that, like, we don't know how to improve what we don't know. Of those that are, we asked, how are you measuring that productivity and our billable hours in terms of the utilization rate? So how you bill versus, what you compensate for. That's the biggest measure people use, as well as just overall firm profitability or project specific profitability. So those are sort of the ways that in general the profession's looking at. Some are looking at billings per employee, or looking at the value of their projects, how much that's invested in by employee as well. So, if you're not yet measuring productivity, these are the ways that your peers are doing so. So I want to, before I get into the forecast, which I always leave to the end because everyone wants to look forward, right? Ends on a hopefully not quite a negative note, but let's talk a little bit about technology, because this has been sort of a passion project for me and my team, is to kind of get a sense of what's happening in technology. So I'm going to get to AI in a second, but if you could kind of flip in your head, are you using artificial intelligence in your projects? How are you? It's the buzz of the town. Is Chat GPT and some of these other kind of AI that's swooped into the kind of general consciousness, right, of late. So we wanted to kind of find out a little bit about what you all are using and what you are exploring and what you're like, nah, not really thinking of using this technology at all. I don't think it's any surprise that BIM is essentially, a mainstay at most architecture firms, right? If you're not using it like entirely for projects, which is that red bar, you're going to be using it, or you're thinking about using it. Only 10% of firms that we talk to, and probably most of them are in, are working in kind of smaller commercial, where they're, or low rise multifamily, like those kind of sectors where you're really close to the owners. So or are those that are in design build firms, or who are in firms that are more closely tied to the contractors. That's where we see firms not using BIM as much, but it's such a small percentage of the profession. VR, real-time rendering, that augmented reality, we're starting to see some pretty good growth there. Enterprise collaboration, so these are technologies that allow you to work remotely. We saw a huge spike in that in 2020, actually coming into the recession too, 2019, 2020, 2021. But there's still a pretty strong percentage that are like, no, we don't really see the need for that. So a quarter don't see the need for some of those enterprise collaboration technology tools. Similar-ish percentage don't see value in the VR. 3D printing, those additive manufacturing, still really small market segment, but about a fifth are using it in their practices and with projects. Mass timber design projects. I also talk about specifying enhanced construction materials. So that's some nanotechnologies and some of those bio-related materials as well. That's kind of down a few. Limited market share and penetration at this point. And about a third are like, no, I'm not really planning to look at it. And some of that's based on where you work. I was doing some focus groups talking to architects about some materials, and we got into discussion about steel and mass timber and concrete, and kind of what was working best where, what kinds of projects. And I remember one of the architects said, well, I don't know, but I'm so getting lobbied by the mass timber folks that I don't know if they would be able to meet the demand for what they're trying to lobby for. So definitely on the mind of architects. And there's been some real cool projects in this part of the US in that space. And certainly when you start to think about the carbon calculations, all three of those structural elements look different, right? And you're making those trade-offs all the time. Parametric design, again, and big data science, less in the architecture space. AI, not yet used, but there's a lot of sort of curiosity about it in terms of using it for firm operations and using it for design related applications. And we did go into this in a little more detail, which I'll show in a second. Some of the other technologies we looked at was kind of offsite construction, drones. And these are folks that are like interested in it in that longer term, that 5-year kind of term is like, oh, maybe there's something here in wearable technologies. Maybe there's something here in geospatial technologies and autonomous vehicles. So kind of like these larger tech trends that we're seeing, is that going to be something people are expecting in construction? So this is construction as opposed to the earlier slide, which was looking at us. I mentioned AI, so just a little bit probing deeper into those numbers. And again, most of y'all are kind of intrigued, like maybe. But as I'm going around and talking to folks, we're actually hearing that they are using it for simple things like this slide, right? Which is getting concepts, right? Or proposals. I don't even think those are on here, but we've heard that from a lot of people like, oh no, I have my template and then I just plug it in and I get my draft, right? I get the first draft and then I can edit from there. So it's kind of helping to speed up some of those parts of getting projects or the construction docs, being able to automate some of the tasks to allow us to do the work that so far anyway AI is really bad at. So I saw Phil Bernstein, who's a professor at Yale and used to be with Autodesk. That's kind of an interesting presentation where he used a bunch of these tools to try to do stuff, and they're kind of ridiculous, the output. So it's very good at some things, still not good at others. And so using it as a tool can really, those that are using it are finding value and saving time through, some of the, again, marketing, pumping things in through zoning, co-compliance, being able to kind of scrape things off the internet and put them into things to save you guys time. So I'm going to end with the outlook, and then I'm going to take questions. I still have a pretty good amount of time with you. So this was June, and we're starting to collect information, or will be starting to collect information in December to publish the new forecast in January. So Kermit Baker, our chief economist, talks to all the other economists that measure and forecast in the construction space, and basically averages them all out. And because of that, it actually reins in some that are more aggressive and some that are more conservative in their forecasts. And so it kind of tends to be a better sort of measure barometer across the board. So in general, spending this year is expected to be up. 525 billion is where the spend this year was, or where the spend was last year, expecting about a 20% bump on that this year. And this is where we think the numbers are going to probably be measured down, cycled down when the January forecast comes out. So keep your eye on that. But the places that it was soft are in commercial. That's the part that we think is going to go down. Institutional in 2024, so that's the yellow bar. Expecting to still kind of have some growth in 2024, and we think that probably won't change too much, but I'll talk about that when I break apart these sectors for you to finish with. On the commercial side, this year, so that's the blue marks, hotels expected to grow. I've talked about this a few times, these charts. So it's coming off really low numbers. Hotel has just got decimated. And so these growth numbers still are growing off of like a really low number. So not that 19 billion isn't quite at the levels that we were seeing. Back in June, there was an expectation that this would increase in 2024. We're expecting that will be pulled back. Office and retail, we think will also be pulled back, even stronger declines predicted or forecasted in 2024, but we'll see how those models shape out. There's still a couple months left in the year to go into those projections next year. So there's always the possibility that something could disrupt or change in a positive way. And see some of that maybe not deepen, but we are expecting these markets just look challenging in a lot of ways. And so, starting to see where some of those declines are. The one place in retail that has been strong, honestly, is coming from warehouses and distribution centers. So not even projects that architects are too much engaged in when we think of the retail space. So again, seeing pullback on that next year. But institutional does look pretty good, right? So we're seeing about 10% across the board increases this year, and expecting to see some blip up next year. I think amusement and recreation will probably flatten a little bit. But a lot of the conditions are in place to keep spending going in education and health. We're probably not going to see new bond measures put out, but we do think there's pretty good conditions that should stay growing. But we'll see what happens in January when we get that forecast back. So now I will take some of your questions. So if you haven't already popped them in to the chat, not the chat, the Q&A section, feel free to do that. So let me go in here. Okay. So someone asked me about capital expenditure spending. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. But I will find them and see if I can throw a slide in. If not immediately, I'll get that in there and have Rebecca follow up with you. Locally and nationally, there is a housing crisis. So where is the lending for multifamily housing? Here in LA, we're seeing a lot of multifamily construction and developers are worried about losing funding. Yes, absolutely. Where is the expectation for lending for multifamily housing? So that's in the commercial lending that I mentioned, the softening. So we're seeing more of the conversions happening nationally for housing crisis. But we are seeing pullback on projects that have not started. So multifamily is a tough one right now from a marketplace perspective. Not only are we not seeing contracts being signed, we're seeing some projects go into delay because of the tightening in lending and the interest rates going up. So the demand is there, but the ability to invest and also be at the market price that's needed. So that's also been some problems with the lending, is that those that were going in for like deep affordable housing projects, that lending has fallen out too, but that's where the need is, right? So, but there's been needs to concede in a lot of local markets. I know here as well, on something that was supposed to be on the affordable housing now, I think a third of the units are market rate because they couldn't make the numbers work. So, I mean, I think it's slow, it's of concern. And I think they're right to be worried about funding challenges coming in the near months. I think it's why we're seeing people leave expensive areas as well. And families start to consolidate again, which was a trend we saw in 2008 to 10. Housing is inadequate. Yes, I mean the conditions of the homes. So those numbers are referring to homes that are not safe or who have potential safety issues, right? So maybe not entirely falling apart, but really do need investment to be assets that will continue to stand and not be in that 1.4% that we lose every year. Is there percentages on the ADUs being rented out just versus those that are increasing the main home square foot value? Let me look around on that. I just saw a presentation that it was rentals. So it was filling in the gap. So that's what we've generally been hearing nationwide, that ADUs aren't adding square footage to someone's existing home, but are being rented out. And there's complicated, again, that's where some of the market challenges in some areas because they won't let you have that many people or let you rent out or use your property in that way. So, or it has to be separate from the home, or so there's different challenges in different localities and states, but is being looked at as on the creating space, so not as just raising market value or size of someone's home. But I will see if I can find the percentages. That's definitely where the trend's been talking about, but let me see if I can actually dig something up, and I'll add that as well. Do the holidays affect earnings? I'm trying to think. Not usually. And the reason I say that is because for every bonuses that are given out, you see layoffs, right? So the end of the year is both a time when there's additional revenues come in. It's also a time when people pull people off the books. And so, you know, from a business earnings perspective, it balances out. From an individual spending, you know, we keep our track on the holiday spending. I think everybody does. What happens in November really does, and December does just tell us something about the health of households, because where are they spending? And if they spend, that means that it will keep conditions healthier to get some of that funding for retail or some of the tax bases, right, in some areas that have consumer goods sales, right, as part of their sale, or have strong sales taxes in their city or states. Are concerned about losing grads to other professions. Is this occurring because other professions are more lucrative, less time consuming? Anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of architecture and structural grads move to PM positions. So, I mean, so it's multidimensional. I think we do have a cultural issue at our firms, right? Every time we've talked to at AIA, we do a lot of surveys of members. And when we talk to staff, they do say that the conditions at architecture firms aren't necessarily places that they want to work. And so that's ... right? So but I think we can work on that, right? So I think we have some guides. We've been having discussions about how you have like an EP friendly firm or a new grad friendly firm, which is a phrase I like better. And what are the things that you can do to sort of make that work-life balance, right? Because you can't always increase money, right? So that, you know, right, you'll know you're running businesses. You got expenses and you got revenues. But there are things you can do, and we are seeing that in our comp survey. And I will, again, I now put three slides I'm going to add, but I will add one about some of the benefits, the soft benefits that we're seeing firms are adding. So flexibility, like more holidays off, like being creative about summer Fridays, right? We're starting to see these kind of, you know, it does dig into your bottom line, but not like, you know, an annual salary increase would, or require, or a guaranteed bonus or something like that, right? So there are things you can do to make a culture better from a place that people want to work. People leave their jobs because they don't make enough money or because of their boss. So, you know, and I don't think we're unique in that. But this next generation is also looking at wanting to belong in their spaces. And those are things that we can do. We can make them not leave because of their boss, right? You can do that. AI can't do that. You can do that. So I think that's one way that we're hearing people leave. That being said, so the other part of your question is getting an architecture degree does give you mad skills. So, and those skills are things that people want in other professions that are more lucrative, right? So a project manager skill set is highly valued, as is other kinds of elements of design thinking, computer skills. These are all kinds of things that architectural students get in schools. You know, I'm an engineer who doesn't practice. Engineering is another one is a skill set that can apply into other professions. You can't become an architect without an architect degree, but you can go do something else with an architect degree, right? So, yeah. So I would say it's something we're trying to keep our eye on and do our part to try to help you guys get the tools to kind of keep people in the profession. It's our interests as well as yours. Typical seasonal dips in the winter and holidays, we do actually seasonally adjust our numbers. So those, the downturns with the ABI, those are seasonally adjusted. So those are actually ticked up a little bit. If that, so yes, most of the numbers I presented are seasonally adjusted. When I think of the interplay between a strong institutional markets and the cost, funding might be strong for institutional work right now, but we've seen an increase in projects that are initially funded and run into headwinds yet. Yes, right. So this is not unique. I do think that the need has been pretty high. So what I mean by that is that education, we were surprised education hasn't gone up and increased sooner, if that makes sense, especially since coming out of the pandemic, states did have some funding to invest and the needs were there. So our you know, when we talk about this, you know, with peers kind of in the construction economy space, we've been sort of surprised that education hasn't been stronger. So I think that's going to stay pretty solid and not fall into some of those cycles just because of what the softness we've had in that. But it is certainly to keep your eye on those local and state roles, right? I mean, tax revenues coming into the states, because if you're starting to see that come down, then yeah, I mean, institutional projects are funded through state funds. So, you know, if the feds are not giving the money to the states are not going to be spending it. But we're feeling pretty good about K-12 public education, less so higher ed. Yeah, so if that maybe gives a little bit of context. Let's see. Interplay. Oh yeah, so we talked about that one. Predictions to take for the commercial office and retail to turn into a positive. Yeah, it is. I think this, I mean, one of the reasons I put up the piece about the conversion of office space, I think we're going to see, and the reason I put up the natural disaster numbers is we are really seeing commercial being turned into a renovation market and not as much new coming in, other than those big glitzy, right, kind of projects. And so that's where our advice is, that we're starting to see a lot more in the renovation and remodeling space in the commercial office sector. Retail is one where the retail numbers that are coming in are, it's really weird, right? Because brick and mortar is going away, but then you're starting to see Netflix build something. I mean, I don't know how many of you are my age, but you know, I saw Blockbuster went away from a digital, you know, streaming service, and now they're going to brick and mortar. So, I mean, I think that a little bit of that is us watching tech, like just watching behavioral trends of consumers to get in front of some of those retail stuff. So that's the stuff I dig looking into for y'all. And so something we're going to be looking at next year is what are people doing? And that's what's going to change retail, right? So when people turn to buy everything online, that changed how people shopped, and then they stayed in their homes, and that changed restaurants. So I think that's what we're trying to look at, right? Like stadiums are getting invested in because concerts are doing great, because people want that connection with their artists in a way that they haven't. I mean, just look at Taylor Swift and Beyonce's tours. I mean, the revenue they have brought into the cities where they have brought those concerts, it's crazy, right? It's like, it's truly stimulating local economies. And so those are the kinds of things that, like, we predicted that probably, right? If you looked at some of those trends. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm digging and looking forward to kind of trying to put some light on for you all. Let's see, science and technology, how does that fit? Science and technology lab. So we look at that from labs. Those are in the higher ed numbers. So they're folded, if they're at a university labs, those are folded into the education numbers, so in institutional. And some I think are in manufacturing as well, right? If it's labs around pharmaceuticals. So those are where those numbers sit for us. Do you have anything on new versus adaptive reuse, modifying existing buildings? So yes, I usually do throw that in, but I voiced over it this time. So about half of architecture firm billings now are in remodeling and renovation projects. And that has stayed pretty consistent. So in the past, we used to see when the economy was bad, we saw remodeling and renovations go up as a percentage of work. And then when the economy is good, we saw that go down. But that really has flipped on its head in recent years. So it stayed pretty solid. And we think that's because of things like natural disasters. We think general, like people sitting on their assets, right, as opposed to doing as much sort of turnover, and more looking at leasing and lending, or sorry, leasing spaces as opposed to selling buildings. So some of that, those pieces are what we think have kept the remodeling and renovation market to be such a strong part of construction industry. Same with schools. We're seeing, and dense cities, right? So they're reinvesting in buildings as opposed to doing tear downs and new builds, or so whether on the same property or adjacent. So we're still seeing some of that, but we do have those percentages, and I can also put that slide. Now I'm up to 5 new slides in this deck. So we'll get these ones up, but I will add those and then we'll let you know, or I can talk to Rebecca about those on the call, getting those slides. Federal programs for affordable housing that would lower the interest rates. I've worked on projects that are melting pot of funding from local, state, and private. Do we see this dip in housing most notably linked to interest rates? Are there other variables? I think the dip is coming from the interest rates and the lending, but we are seeing governments aware of that, right? So we are starting to see some incentives being put in place, but more at like the local, state level than federal. But there's federal dollars that were put in place from the federal legislation that passed last year earlier this year and in 2022, and that was specifically to do remodeling and renovation projects. So I think it's more been investing in current buildings and bringing those up to market than it has been, I think, in the new builds in the affordable housing space. But it's tricky everywhere. So we are starting to see interventions being considered. The feds right now are it's very hard. It's so partisan. It is hard to be getting things in to at the federal level. So we are starting to see some kind of really interesting things happening in public-private partnerships in local development areas. I'm in a super rapidly growing part of the United States where I live, and we're definitely seeing a lot of public-private partnerships in developing some of those lands. Oh my goodness. Analyzing client types. So yes, so in our firm survey, which you can pull off aia.org/ oh, you know what? That's what I should have up. Let me throw that slide up. aia.org/firm survey. You can pull down our firm survey and it has the distribution of client types. So if you could just pull that right out of that report. And it's downloadable for members for free. So you just type in your member and you get it. Let's see. Does AIA have a forecast on conversion of multifamily make sense to developers? We do not track that. Yes, agreed. So we are the only problem with prospecting of so to read the question. Does AIA do a forecast on, oh my goodness, that might be my last question. You know what? I'll also take the very, very last question. So high vacancy in office buildings since the pandemic. Do we have a forecast on when conversions to multifamily will make sense to developers? No, we don't. It seems that savvy developers would jump on those opportunities before those conversions become saturated market, right? Before there's competition for prime buildings. We agree. The problem is lending is so difficult right now that we're not seeing as much of that prospecting happening for developers because they're just not able to liquidate assets in order, or they're not able to divest to invest, right? So but those that can probably are. We always see like a real spike in I used to track green buildings when I was at Dodge, and we would always see big spikes and at tough times in building, like it going all in, because those that could afford to buy were looking for buildings that had technology, the greenest stuff, performing the highest standards, because they could afford it. So the demand was there. So we do see some interesting innovations happen in a soft market. So those that can't afford it, I think we will start to see some of that in the developer space. And I'm going to end with the question on the breakdown of firm sizes within AIA National. Yes. So there are about 18,000-ish firms in the United States, and 72% of them have under 10 employees, and 6% of them have more than 50 employees. So that's the distribution of firms. However, where people work is almost the entire inverse. So about 12% of the architectural workforce are at those small firms of under 10 employees, and more than half of the profession is employed at the larger firms of over 50. And if even bigger percent, I think it's like 28% are at firms with over 100 people. So there's not that many of those firms, but they employ most of the profession. So that's why retaining people in the profession, I would say where the large firms go is the expectation of where the workforce goes. I see there's lots of fun slides. I wish I could stay. I wish I was in person with you all. I love talking about things in person with folks. I will try to get some answers to the questions that folks asked. I'll work with AIA California to do that. We'll get the slides that I did present to you today. I do apologize for the 5 to 10 minute delay in the beginning. And I can't believe as many of you stuck around for the whole time as you did. So thanks for spending your lunch with me. And always reach out to us at economics@aia.org, or my full name, Michele Russo @aia.org. And anytime, you're our members, and we're here to support you.
Thank you so much, Michele. This was so informative, well-rounded. It was amazing. Lots of thanks in the chat. I know you're not monitoring it, but everyone is just raving about it. So thank you very, very much. For those of you who have made it this far, we'll go ahead and post your LUs for you. And as Michele and I have both mentioned, we will go ahead and post the recording and her slides on the AIA California website shortly. And we will hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.